People fantasize about confrontation. They imagine it happens with shouting, with slammed doors, with veins standing out on someone's neck while the whole world stops to witness the explosion. They think breaking points are loud. But that's not how real life works. Real breaking points are quiet. Quiet in the way a fuse burns in the dark. Quiet in the way someone sets down a coffee mug before changing a room. Quiet in the way a truth lands heavier than any threat. The day my wife made 2 grown adults sprint down my driveway wasn't loud at all. There was no raised voice, no threat, no dramatic choice of words. Just a calm sentence spoken by someone who has spent years turning chaos into order. Someone who knows authority doesn't need volume. They ran because they realized something terrifying in 1 second. They weren't the authority they thought they were. Up until that moment, the HOA board in my community behaved like they wore invisible badges. Not real badges, imagined authority, the kind printed in handbooks and self-importance. They believed policy was law. They believed silence was agreement. They believed fear was compliance. And most of the time they were right. People complied. People paid fines to avoid arguments. People redid their lawns because a letter looked official. People removed decorations because someone on a committee thought they were non-compliant. In an ordinary neighborhood, that's how power works. Not by force, but by assumption. Assumed authority becomes real when nobody challenges it. Which is exactly why those 2 board members walked into my garage with a clipboard and a phone camera like they were performing a legal inspection. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They didn't hesitate. They acted like walking 2 feet into my home wasn't a violation, like it was simply part of the role they assigned themselves. When I first confronted them, there was no fear in their posture. The woman stood straight, repeating policy language as if she memorized it for this moment. The man positioned himself between me and the shelf they came to photograph, as if the shelf was evidence and I was a suspect standing too close. The strangest part? They weren't villains. They didn't look evil. They didn't even look angry. They looked confident. Confident in a way only people who have never been challenged can look. Like they believed they were performing a duty, that they were the ones protecting the neighborhood from someone like me. A shelf, paint cans, Christmas decorations left from last winter. They were performing a role that gave them meaning. And meaning is dangerous when the person wearing it has no idea what real authority looks like. Then my wife walked in. Not like a firefighter running into smoke. Not like a soldier bursting into a fight. She walked in like a person who came looking for her coffee mug. Sweatpants. Pullover. Hair undone. Calm. She didn't shout. She didn't posture. She asked one question. Did you enter with permission? 7 words. 7 words that changed everything in that garage. Something in their faces flickered. Not guilt, but confusion. Confusion that someone had the courage to ask a question that implied the answer wasn't obvious. Then she placed her coffee mug down on the workbench like it was nothing. Like the entire situation was simply a puzzle she needed both hands to solve. She told them to step away. Her tone didn't rise. Her breath didn't change. Her posture didn't shift. Just, I'm a U.S. Marshal. You're trespassing. Step away from the property. There are sentences that change rooms. This one changed people. I've never seen 2 adults move faster without being chased. They didn't walk. They didn't back out. They ran, one hand gripping a clipboard like evidence of their mistake, the other lifting a phone that was still recording by accident. Down the driveway, into sunlight, out of the illusion they had built around themselves. That moment didn't just expose their mistake. It exposed the entire structure that placed them in my garage. That was the spark, the end of the illusion, the start of everything that followed. Because you would think a normal HOA would apologize. You would think someone would knock later, embarrassed, trying to clean up the mess. They didn't. They did something worse. They tried to justify it. They tried to rewrite their actions into something they could defend, because admitting the truth meant admitting their power was always smaller than their confidence. And real authority doesn't need rewriting. This story isn't about a shelf. It's about the line every homeowner spends their life assuming is understood. The line between community rules and personal thresholds. Doors aren't symbolic. Garages aren't public. Policy doesn't unlock private space. People do that by pretending it does. And eventually, someone has to say the thing that resets everything. No, just that. No, you can't enter here. No, your title isn't a key. No, your clipboard isn't a badge. Sometimes it takes one quiet voice in a messy garage to remind everyone what property really means. And what authority never can. That was the moment everything shifted. And part 1 begins with what came before the sprint. The weeks that led to that collision between fake power and real consequences. Because nothing explosive starts in the explosion. Everything starts in the silence people overlook. I didn't move into this neighborhood expecting a fight. Nobody does. People buy houses for space, peace, a backyard that feels like freedom, and a driveway where kids can learn to ride bikes without traffic roaring past. Nobody thinks about the fine print that comes with the fence line. The realtor talked about school rankings, backyard sunlight, garage size, storage space. She talked about walkable sidewalks and friendly neighbors and a community park. She talked about the HOA like it was a feature, not a structure, like it was meant to organize block parties, not enforce compliance with the force of someone who finally found a place where people had to listen to them. Looking back, there were signs. I just didn't recognize them because they came wrapped in politeness. A neighbor mentioned how trash bins needed to be moved by 8 p.m. sharp, not in a friendly reminder way, but like he was reciting something carved into a stone tablet. Someone else told me how Halloween decorations were restricted to tasteful, non-inflatable thematic displays. It sounded ridiculous, like a joke performed in a deadpan tone, but she didn't laugh. She said it like she was repeating something people had been punished for not understanding. I shrugged it off. Everyone has rules. Every community has expectations. It didn't feel heavy. Not yet. What I didn't realize was that the HOA had been operating for years with no one asking why. An unchallenged authority doesn't stay reasonable. It grows in the direction of its confidence. The first letter arrived on my 3rd month here. A generic violation notice printed in a way that made small issues feel like legal infractions. Visible storage in garage when door is open. It wasn't dramatic, just irritating. I had left the garage door half open while reorganizing shelves. A ladder leaned against the wall. A box of holiday decorations sat on the floor. Someone drove by, took a photo, sent it to the board, and within 24 hours, I received a notice that felt like a citation. Not a conversation, not a friendly heads up, a formal warning. The tone wasn't, "Hey neighbor, careful." It was, "You failed to comply." That was the moment I noticed the difference between community and committee. Community talks, committee documents. I called the number on the notice. Nobody answered, so I left a voicemail asking if someone could explain the policy. I didn't sound angry, just curious. The callback never came. Instead, I got a second notice. Failure to correct previous violation. Nobody asked if I got the message. Nobody knocked. Nobody tried to talk. It was as if the HOA assumed paper is how adults communicate. That was the moment I wrote my first email. Polite, reasonable, asking questions. I didn't threaten. I didn't argue. I asked for clarity. Mistake. Not because of the question, but because of what questions represent to people who have built themselves on not being questioned. Questions imply transparency. Transparency implies accountability. Accountability implies limits. And people who operate without limits don't like discovering they exist. Little did I know that one email, one reasonable request for the rules page number, planted a seed in someone's mind that I was a problem. Not because of what I did, but because I didn't immediately fold. I saw their responses shift. Not drastically, subtly. Tone hardened. Sentences became more formal. Language became policy-heavy. It was like they were copying paragraphs from a handbook they had barely read themselves. I showed the email to my wife. She skimmed it with the patience of someone who has seen reports filled with legal jargon that doesn't mean anything. Then she raised an eyebrow. "They're not answering your question," she said. "They're answering your dissent." I didn't understand the difference at first, but she did. She's trained to see it. There is a specific tone people adopt when they believe they are justified in telling someone what to do. Not because they're right, but because the other person didn't immediately agree. That tone had arrived. The second clue came from a story whispered by our next-door neighbor, a quiet elderly man who spends afternoons trimming his hedges meticulously like it's therapy. He told me, in a roundabout way, that the board once told him his hedge height violated emergency responder visibility. His hedge visibility, he explained, uncomfortable, that he had stood in his yard while a board member measured the hedge with a tape measure, telling him they needed to ensure safety compliance. I asked if he understood what that meant. He said no. He trimmed the hedge anyway. When I asked why, he shrugged. I don't want trouble. That sentence echoed in my head for days. I don't want trouble. It explained everything. Why people paid fines quietly. Why nobody questioned letters. Why Halloween decorations became regulated like government equipment. It wasn't that people agreed with the rules. They just didn't want to be the one who causes emails, the one who gets attention, the one who is now a problem. Fear of attention is a powerful compliance tool. And that is the environment the HOA had grown in, like a plant fed by silence. They didn't become intrusive overnight. They evolved into it step by step, unchallenged. And I stepped into the story mid-evolution, unaware that by simply asking a question, I had become a character in their narrative, the narrative where authority must be upheld at any cost. I didn't know any of this. Not until the day they walked into my garage. The day everything brittle snapped under the weight of a truth they weren't designed to hold. I only understood how deep the problem went the morning I found someone standing 3 feet inside my garage, camera raised. It was a Saturday. The kind of Saturday that feels like soft sunlight and simple tasks. Coffee in hand, a half-finished project waiting in the garage, music playing from your phone in the background. I wasn't thinking about rules or policies or bylaws. I was thinking about bolts and drill bits and whether the metal shelf I bought would handle the weight of paint cans. Garage open, door halfway up. The world felt normal, until it didn't. At first, I thought the sound I heard was a neighbor walking by. Then I heard a voice. Not loud, not apologetic. Matter of fact, like someone documenting a crime scene. Shelf height exceeds visibility standard from street view. The sentence didn't even make sense to me in real time. Shelf. Visibility. Standard. I turned around. 2 people stood inside my garage, not outside, not at the edge, but inside. One holding a clipboard with printed pages clipped to it. The other holding up a phone, recording the shelf from multiple angles like they were building a case. There was no knock. No greeting. No excuse me. Just 2 strangers behaving like my personal property was a public exhibit. For a moment, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Your home is such a protected space that when someone stands in it without permission, your mind rejects it before your body reacts. Then my voice caught up. What are you doing? Not yelled. Not aggressive. Just confused. The woman didn't flinch. She turned slightly, like I was interrupting something she considered official. We're conducting a compliance review. Compliance review. 2 words that sound harmless in a meeting room. 2 words that feel violative in your garage. You're inside my house, I said, the confusion fading into something sharper. This is private property. She didn't back away. She didn't seem embarrassed. She responded with a tone I'd heard in her emails, the tone of someone who believes the documentation in her hand is more powerful than the space she's standing in. This area is visible from common property when the door is open. That makes it subject to association review. I stared at her, trying to understand the logic that makes my garage part of common property, because the door wasn't closed enough. You didn't knock, I said. You entered without permission. The man finally lowered his phone, but he didn't look sorry. He looked annoyed, like I was obstructing procedure. He gestured at the shelf. You've already received 2 notices. Failure to correct gives the board authority to verify non-compliance. That sentence was rehearsed. I could hear it. Memorized. Defended. Used before. My heart started hammering, not from fear, but from the realization that these people believed this. They truly believed a notice, a piece of paper without my signature, gave them the right to walk into my home. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was assumed entitlement, assumed power, assumed authority. The clipboard woman raised the paper slightly. Refusal to cooperate can be added to the violation. Refusal to cooperate. I remember thinking how insane that phrase sounded when I hadn't even been given the chance to refuse. You walked into my garage, I repeated. You are trespassing. The woman's eyebrows lifted, not in surprise, but in disbelief that I would use that word. To her, trespassing was something criminals did, not something people with clipboards did. She shook her head slightly. No, this is standard review. Standard review. Standard review of my tools, my paint cans, my half-finished shelf. Something inside me shifted, a click like a gear finally engaging. Rules are only respected when they respect boundaries. This wasn't respect. This was control wearing neighborly language like a costume. I stepped forward, placing myself between them and the shelf. Back up. 3 words. Not yelled. Not emotional. Just a line being drawn. One that should have never needed drawing. The man took a half step back. The woman didn't. She squared her shoulders. A gesture so small it would be invisible if you weren't looking for signs of challenge. We're within our rights. Within our rights. It echoed in my head like a question. I opened my mouth, not sure what I was going to say, when I heard footsteps behind me. Soft ones. Not urgent. Not rushed. Just purposeful. My wife stepped into the garage doorway still holding a coffee mug, hair slightly messy from sleep, wearing a dark pullover and fitted pants. She looked at the 2 strangers in our garage like someone who walked into a conversation mid-sentence and already understood everything. No fear. No confusion. Just calm assessment. What's happening? She asked, not looking at me, not looking at the shelf, eyes directly on the woman with the clipboard. The woman's tone didn't change. We're conducting a compliance review. Your household has multiple unresolved violations related to visible storage. My wife didn't let her finish. She didn't interrupt loudly. She didn't raise her hand. She just spoke over the explanation with a voice designed to stop motion without force. Did you enter with permission? 7 words. The exact same 7 from the hook. This time I watched what they did. The woman blinked. Twice. The way people do when a question lands like a blow they didn't see coming. We're authorized by the board to. That's not what I asked. My wife said, tone steady, unchanged. I asked if you had permission to enter our home. Our home. The words reframed everything. Not a garage. Not a space. A home. The man opened his mouth. Closed it. His eyes lowered to the clipboard, like the answer might be printed somewhere between the lines. My wife set her coffee mug down on the workbench beside me, carefully, without breaking eye contact. That tiny movement, coffee mug to wood, felt heavier than every policy document in that clipboard, because it meant this wasn't a conversation anymore. This was correction. She reached into her jacket, not fast, not dramatic, just routine. I had seen her do that motion countless times in parking lots, in airports, in places where someone needed clarity about who she was. She held out a leather wallet badge case, opened it with one practiced movement, revealing her credentials. The badge glinted under the sunlight pouring in from the driveway. Gold. Raised seal. Federal identification. A symbol of real authority. Not imagined. Not printed. Not elected. Earned. I'm a U.S. Marshal, she said, voice controlled, steady, professional. You are trespassing. Step away from the property immediately. No threat, no emotion, just law. The reaction was instant, not confusion, not negotiation. Fear, real fear. The kind that comes when someone's entire understanding of their authority collapses in 1 second. When they realize the rules they were wielding like weapons don't exist in the space they stepped into. The man stepped back first. 1 foot, then the other. Clipboard pressed to his chest like a shield. The woman's hand trembled. Not visibly, but enough that the papers shifted. We're authorized, she stammered. No, my wife said, still calm. You're not. Just that. for words shutting the door on an entire narrative they had built around themselves. The woman's eyes flicked to the badge, to my wife's face, to the garage floor, like she was searching for an escape path. Then she moved. Fast. They both did. Not walking. Not excusing themselves. Running. Past me. Past my wife. Down the driveway into the sunlight like the concrete behind them was burning. Clipboard shaking. Phone still recording by accident. Breath tight. Gone. That's when I realized the truth. They weren't afraid of my wife. They were afraid of the reality she represented. Because once someone shows you what actual authority looks like, you have to confront the fact that everything you've been doing is imitation. They didn't run from the badge. They ran from losing the illusion. That moment should have ended everything. A simple apology. A letter. A reset. But people who build their identity around authority don't let go easily. They don't apologize. They retaliate. Not loudly, but quietly. Quiet emails. Quiet policy changes. Quiet pressure disguised as procedure. In the days that followed, something in the air changed. Not a conflict. Campaign. The garage felt larger after they ran. Not physically, emotionally. Like the air expanded into the space they had taken without asking. My wife didn't move for a second. She stood in the doorway watching the spot where they disappeared. Her badge still in her hand, her expression unreadable. Not angry, not triumphant. Just still. That stillness is what most people misunderstand about real authority. They think it's loud. They think it's force. But real power knows what it is without needing to perform it. She closed the badge wallet, slid it back into her jacket, and looked at me. "You okay?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately. There's a strange moment after adrenaline leaves your blood where your brain suddenly registers all the thoughts it suppressed. Confusion, disbelief, anger. All trying to speak at once. "They just walked in," I said. It sounded stupid out loud, obvious. But those 4 words carried the weight of a realization I hadn't fully absorbed yet. They walked in. Into my home. Into a private space that existed behind a boundary everyone understands without being told. My wife nodded once, picking up her coffee cup like she hadn't just made 2 grown adults sprint like teenagers caught spraying graffiti. "They weren't here to inspect," she said. "They were here to document." Document. It was the right word. Not verify. Not observe. Collect evidence, evidence they planned to control. I sat on the workbench stool, staring at the shelf that had somehow become the most politically charged piece of metal in my life. No special features. No secrets. Just a shelf. A shelf that never deserved to become a battlefield. Something in me shifted. Not a burst of anger. A slow burn of clarity. "This isn't about a rule," I said. "No," she replied. "It's about compliance." The word compliance had a different tone when she said it. Not the version written on glossy HOA brochures. The real version, the version that exists in systems built on quiet obedience. She sipped her coffee, now cold, and made a face. "They're going to escalate," she said casually, like she was reading tomorrow's weather, and it included a storm we should not be surprised by. I frowned. "How?" "They were caught." She almost smiled, not amused, but knowing. People who believe in their authority don't stop when they're proven wrong. They rewrite the story so they can keep believing. I didn't fully understand how right she was. Not until the next morning. The email arrived at 7:14 a.m. Subject line, urgent. Violation update. No greeting. No context. Just a PDF attachment and 3 sentences. Upon further review, your violation has entered escalation. The board has voted to impose corrective measures. Please refer to the attached compliance protocol. Corrective measures. A phrase that would be ridiculous if it wasn't aimed directly at the space where I drink coffee on weekends and store rusty screwdrivers. I opened the PDF. 4 pages. Diagrams. Measurements. Sections quoted from the handbook like scripture. A list of mandatory corrections. A deadline. And at the bottom, a sentence so arrogant it felt surreal. Failure to cooperate may result in board access to verify resolution. Board access. They were doubling down. Not backing out, expanding the justification. Entering my garage wasn't a mistake to them. It was correct procedure. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time before typing a response. Not a threat. Not anger. Just one line. You entered my home without permission. Send. No emojis. No politeness. No request for clarity because clarity wasn't the issue anymore. 10 minutes later, another email arrived. Shorter. Colder. Pursuant to Section 4C, visible storage falls under community oversight when exposed. Exposed. Like the word described a violation, not sunlight hitting a paint can. I wasn't angry anymore. I was fascinated. This was the psychology of power, not real power, but the kind that grows in small structures with nobody watching. When people hold authority in a vacuum, they believe all space belongs to them until proven otherwise. My wife read the email from across the kitchen island. Her hair pulled back, her posture relaxed. Everything about her the opposite of escalation. They're scared, she said. I looked at her. Doesn't look like fear. It is, she said with certainty. When someone with power oversteps, and instead of the situation collapsing, they get caught by someone who outranks them, they're forced to confront a truth they've been avoiding. What truth? She sipped her reheated coffee and met my eyes. That their authority was always imaginary. Imaginary authority. The phrase landed like a definition I'd been searching for since the first letter. Authority exists in two forms. Real authority, granted by law, education, oath, responsibility, and accountability. And imagined authority, granted by a title printed on paper, reinforced by silence, and powered by fear of conflict. Imagined authority collapses the moment someone says no, not angrily, just clearly. No, this isn't yours. No, you don't get to decide that. No, policy doesn't cross thresholds. That weekend, the neighborhood began to whisper. Not loudly. Whispers are born in driveways, in quiet conversations near mailboxes, in the pause before someone waves goodbye. A neighbor 2 houses down paused while walking his dog and asked, "You okay?" Heard something about a shelf. His tone carried embarrassment, not suspicion. Like he didn't want to say it, but he needed to. I could see the struggle in his eyes, loyalty to the community versus fear of being noticed. I nodded. "We're fine." He waited, not satisfied, uncertain. "You know how they get," he said quietly. How they get. 3 words that revealed something deeper than any email. A lived experience the community already understood. People didn't disagree with the board because they didn't know how. They didn't disagree because they didn't want to be the story. Those 2 walking into my garage wasn't the beginning of a problem. It was the symptom of one. The real problem was the years of quiet compliance that made that walk feel natural to them. They believed they could enter because nobody ever refused to open. The next letter arrived on Tuesday. Not electronic, physical. Printed. Folded. Delivered like a legal notice. Bold header. Final warning. As if the word final meant anything in a conflict built on fiction. The letter said I needed to attend a board hearing to resolve unresolved violations through proper procedure. Hearing. Procedure. Words that make small people feel big, especially when used to disguise retaliation. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the letter. My wife read it over my shoulder. "They want a stage," she said. "What?" "A hearing is a stage. They don't want resolution. They want a performance." "A performance of what?" She looked at me with sympathy. Not for her, but for the situation. "Of authority." A performance of authority. It sounded absurd. It sounded dramatic. It sounded exactly right. People who've never held power over anything significant often build entire theatrical sets around the tiny domains where someone gave them a title. A badge-shaped piece of metal. A laminated card. A seat at a table. Clipboard. Symbols of power for people who never met power in its real form. "They won't apologize," she said. "They'll escalate until they feel justified again." "And what do we do?" She took the letter from my hands, folded it neatly, and placed it aside. "We show them what resolution actually looks like." I didn't understand what she meant yet, but I trusted it. It wasn't confidence in conflict. It was confidence in truth. She had seen rooms filled with more danger and more ego than this one, rooms where people actually had something to lose. And still, her approach was the same. Truth is calm. Truth doesn't rush. Truth arrives. And it arrived the following Saturday, the day of the hearing, the day the board thought they would put on their performance, the day the neighborhood learned what really happened in my garage. Not through rumors, not through letters, not through policy language, but through the moment the truth walked into the room wearing a dark suit and speaking without anger. And that moment would be the beginning of everything that followed. The votes, the revelations, the collapse of imagined authority. But part one ends here, not with confrontation, with the door to the clubhouse opening, and my wife stepping inside before me, calm, controlled, carrying nothing but her badge and the truth. And every person in that room, whether they trusted us or feared conflict, was about to understand the difference between power you print and power you earn. That was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't a story about a shelf in a garage. This was a story about a community remembering its backbone. The clubhouse smelled like paper and anxiety. I'd never really paid attention to this room before. I'd walked past it on my way to the fitness center, seen through the glass when people rented it for birthday parties, heard muffled voices when the board met on Wednesday nights. But now it felt different, like the place itself was waiting. People were already seated when we walked in. Rows of folding chairs, some straight, some crooked, like they'd been arranged in a hurry. A long table at the front with a white plastic cloth that didn't quite reach both ends. 6 board members, sitting in a line like judges waiting to deliver verdicts nobody asked them to deliver. And then there was the crowd. Quiet, but not silent. Quiet like a held breath. Quiet like who will speak first. Quiet like, do we finally get to talk about the thing we were told to shut up about? Eyes followed us to the front row. Not aggressively. Not suspiciously. Curious. Tense. Relieved, in a way, like someone finally said the thing they've been too afraid to say out loud, and now everyone else is allowed to feel something about it. We didn't take a seat at the board table. We sat in the audience. That mattered. They expected us up front, on display, defendants at their performance. But we weren't here to be the show. We were here because truth belongs in the room, not on the stage. The board looked annoyed by that. A small, petty kind of annoyance that only matters to people who care about seating positions as symbols of power. The president, a woman named Karen, cleared her throat into the microphone like she was preparing for trial. "Thank you all for attending this hearing," she began, eyes sweeping across the room not to connect, but to measure. That was always her style. Every glance felt like checking boxes. Every smile felt like filing something away. She launched into an opening statement. Not about the violation. Not about the incident. About policy. She spoke like she was reading a manual. Section 3.4 outlines storage visibility. Section 2.1 provides enforcement authority. The board conducts compliance checks. My mind drifted not because the words didn't matter, but because I could see the strategy. She wasn't talking to us. She was talking around us, shaping the narrative for the crowd before the story even began. The man next to her, the one who recorded my shelf, nodded in rhythm to her sentences, like his neck muscles were tied to each word. He looked more pale now. Same posture, less confidence. Beside him, his partner, clipboard woman, didn't look up. She stared at the table, fingers tight on her papers, jaw clenched so hard I could see it from 10 feet away. Karen continued, "This hearing is not about individuals. It's about consistency and fairness in application of community standards." No, that wasn't true. If it were about consistency, they wouldn't have entered my garage. If it were about fairness, they would have knocked. If it were about community, they would have talked. But comfortable lies always use big words. Fairness, consistency, standards. Words you can't argue with because they sound like virtue, even when used to justify violation. She finished her speech and looked at me. "Would you like to respond?" Not a question. An invitation to walk onto her stage, into her structure, into the frame she built. I opened my mouth to answer, but my wife stood. She didn't ask permission. She didn't look at the microphone. She simply stood. The entire room turned to her. Not because she demanded attention, because she carried it. People who have spent their lives protecting others don't try to take space. They become space. She didn't hold her badge. She didn't posture. She spoke the way you speak to a room when you respect it enough to be honest. 2 members of the board entered our home without permission, she said. 2. Not the board. Not the association. 2 humans. 2 choices. 2 actions. Her voice didn't waver. They took photographs of personal property, attempted to justify entry by citing policy, and when confronted, refused to leave. The room didn't react loudly. It reacted internally. You could hear silence shift. People adjusting in their seats, not fidgeting but absorbing. She wasn't accusing. She was telling. Facts. No adjectives. No attacks. No anger. Just chronology. They entered without knocking, without informing the homeowner, and without any legal authority. Legal authority. 2 words that cut through every printed rule on every page in front of Karen. The board members didn't interrupt. They couldn't. Because you can argue feelings. You can argue interpretations. You can argue tone. But you can't argue events. Karen exhaled sharply through her nose. I need to clarify, she said, leaning toward the mic. We did not enter a home. We entered a garage. She didn't finish. Someone in the back, a voice I didn't recognize, spoke loudly enough to break the official tone. It's attached to the house, he said. If someone walks into my garage, they're in my home. Heads nodded. Not dramatically, naturally. Truth resonates physically. You don't need a speech. You need recognition. Karen's eyes flickered. Just for a moment. Like she hadn't expected that voice. She tried again. As the board, we are empowered to. My wife didn't raise her volume, but her words overrode the script like a louder frequency beneath a quiet one. You are not empowered to enter private property. She didn't say it with hostility. She said it the way someone states gravity. Nobody debates gravity. This board is a voluntary community organization. You are not law enforcement. You are not inspectors with statutory authority. Your neighbors elected to manage shared spaces, not to invade personal ones. Invade. The word hung there. Not dramatic, just accurate. And accuracy matters more than dramatic words. Someone in the second row whispered, "Thank you." Like their lungs finally opened. You could feel the shift. Not an uprising, not yet, but alignment. Truth revealing itself not through persuasion, but through relief. Relief that someone said what everyone knew but didn't want to be punished for saying. Karen clasped her hands. Her voice sharpened, like her tone went through a filter labeled defense. The board acted under the belief that visible property is subject to review. Belief, not authority, not permission. Belief. The room heard it even if she didn't mean to reveal it. Belief is not law. Belief is not consent. Belief is not a key. The man with the clipboard shifted, his body smaller now, shoulders curved inward like he was folding himself into his chair. People were watching him not with hostility, with understanding of scale. The illusion was crumbling. My wife didn't press. She didn't humiliate. She simply said, "You cannot use belief to justify entry." It wasn't personal. It was structural. The moment felt like standing on a fault line. 2 versions of reality colliding. The one they performed. The one that actually exists. Karen tried to reclaim narrative. She leaned forward. I acknowledge that perhaps procedure could have been clearer. Someone laughed. Not mocking but shocked. Clearer? A woman on the left side said. They walked into someone's garage and took pictures. It wasn't a question. It was the summary that made everyone realize the absurdity. A garage with paint cans and tools. 2 adults acting like detectives. Not policy. Theater. Karen's tone hardened. It is the responsibility of the homeowner to. No, my wife said. Just that. A single rejection of the premise. No. Not how responsibility is defined here. not how blame shifts, not how consequences are assigned. No, the sound of it changed the room more than any argument could. Because in that no, people heard every letter they ever swallowed instead of speaking up. The man with the phone finally spoke. Quiet, brittle. We didn't mean harm. And just like that, it was human, not a board, a man, a choice, a mistake he didn't know how to own. My wife nodded once. I believe you, she said. The room inhaled. Nobody expected that. Not because she was wrong, but because people expected conflict. She gave truth instead of punishment. You didn't mean harm, she repeated. But harm doesn't require intent. Silence. A deep, reflective silence that didn't accuse, it educated. Entering someone's home without consent is trespassing. Even if you believe it serves a policy. Even if it feels justified. Even if you think you're helping. Karen's fingers tightened around her pen, knuckles white. What are you asking for? She said, voice brittle disguised as composed. Everyone waited. My wife didn't hesitate. Accountability, she said. Not punishment. Not humiliation. Accountability. She looked at the two who entered our garage, not the board, them. I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here to put something back where it belongs. They didn't understand yet. The room did. Because people know the difference between revenge and correction. My wife continued. This board needs to acknowledge that entering someone's home was wrong. And it needs to create a policy that ensures it never happens again. To us or anyone here. Policy not to enforce power, but to limit it. That's real leadership. Not more rules. Better boundaries. Karen tried to counter, but the momentum had shifted. Someone in the third row raised their hand without waiting to be called. How many times has this happened? Not whispered, demanded. Karen opened her mouth. Closed it. Everyone watched her fail to answer. That silence was louder than any speech. It meant there were stories. Stories like mine. Stories buried under I don't want trouble. A man near the aisle said quietly, they entered my backyard once. Said it was part of a drainage check. Someone else. They photographed my patio during my daughter's birthday party. Another. They inspected my shed while I was at work. Whispers turned into confessions. Confessions turned into patterns. Patterns turned into something undeniable. This wasn't isolated. This was habitual. The board wasn't shocked by the truth. They were shocked they couldn't hide it anymore. Karen lifted the microphone again, her voice searching for structure. I understand emotions are high, but we need to return to procedure. No, someone said. Not my wife. A neighbor. A soft-spoken woman who trimmed her roses every morning at 7 a.m. No, she repeated. We need to return to boundaries. The room nodded. Not out of rebellion. Out of recognition. Boundaries. The thing everyone here assumed the board understood. But the board didn't understand boundaries. They understood control. My wife stepped forward, not to dominate, but to end the ambiguity. The board needs to adopt a policy stating no member enters personal property without explicit consent. Ever. Not hidden. Not implied. Explicit. Consent. Ever. Karen opened her mouth, but the crowd was ahead of her. Yes. 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 It wasn't shouting. It was agreement spoken like relief. The man with the clipboard swallowed hard. His voice cracked when he spoke. I'm sorry. It was real. Unpolished. Unplanned. Karen stared at him like betrayal. But he wasn't betraying her. He was returning to reality. I thought we were doing what we were supposed to, he said. My wife nodded. Intent doesn't erase impact. Karen's face tightened, a leader losing a stage she built around fiction. Then let's vote, someone said. Not a suggestion. A decision. The board froze. They wanted procedure. The room wanted resolution. My wife stepped back, giving the moment to the community because leaders know when to speak and when to let people find their voice. Hands rose. Old hands. Young hands. Hands that spent years holding back stories. In seconds, every row was filled with arms lifted in unity. Only the board's hands stayed down. Not voting. Hiding. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. People elected to represent the community refused to participate in a democratic decision. That moment didn't feel like an uprising. It felt like balance correcting itself. A collective realization. Authority is granted, not assumed. Power rests in the many, not the few. Rules serve people, not the other way around. Karen's voice broke, a crack in polished tone. This vote isn't official. Someone answered before my wife could. It's real. Real. Not official. Real. And real beats official every time imaginary authority is exposed. Part 2 ends here. Not with punishment, not with fireworks, but with a room full of neighbors raising their hands, remembering that their homes belong to them. Their voices matter, and no clipboard can enter a doorway without permission ever again. The board didn't fall today. It collapsed under the weight of the truth it tried to avoid. Walking out of the clubhouse didn't feel like victory. It felt like stepping out of a courtroom you didn't want to be in, holding a weight you didn't realize you were carrying until a room full of people helped lift it. The late afternoon sun hit my eyes, sharp and warm, like everything just got brighter without warning. People lingered outside the glass doors, in clusters of 2s and 3s, talking quietly. Not gossip, processing. The way you talk after seeing something that changes the way your world works, even if the change is small and quiet. I saw neighbors I'd barely spoken to in 6 months approach one another like they were meeting for the first time. The question was always the same. How long has this been happening? Not accusation. Discovery. As if the moment truth escaped the room, everyone felt entitled to their own pain. A man with a baseball cap spoke to the woman who laughed during the meeting. They told me I had to remove my kid's bike from the porch, he said, voice tight, like repeating it made him angry for the first time. I thought it was just me. A younger couple listened with eyes full of that fragile relief you get when you realize you weren't crazy. The thing that made you feel isolated was happening to everyone too polite or afraid to complain. My wife stood a few feet away, not at the center of anything. Just present, silent, letting people come to her only if they wanted. She wasn't leading a movement. She was witnessing one form itself. That's how real change starts. Not with speeches, with recognition. The people who walked past her did so with a quiet nod, a brief touch on the arm, a whispered thank you under their breath. Not for stopping the board, but for making the moment safe enough for them to speak. Truth is contagious. Once someone says aloud what everyone else buried, silence becomes expensive. Keeping quiet becomes more painful than telling the story. I watched an older woman, one who never made eye contact when we passed on the sidewalk, approach my wife like she'd been rehearsing the walk for weeks. Her voice trembled, but not from fear. They came into my backyard last spring, she said quietly. They said the trees might fall across the property line. They took pictures of the trunk without even asking. She blinked fast, not crying, fighting the memory of shame. I didn't want trouble, she whispered. Those 4 words again. The refrain of this entire neighborhood. My wife listened without speaking, without offering advice or solutions or moral conclusions. She just listened, and you could see something release in the woman's posture, like someone finally took their hand off her throat. The woman walked away lighter. Listening can do that. The board members didn't come outside right away. Of course they didn't. They were probably still inside, telling themselves the meeting was one moment and that policy would win when the dust settled. They didn't understand yet that dust isn't chaos. Dust is what settles after chaos. We walked home after 30 more minutes of conversations. The street was quiet. The kind of quiet where you realize the neighborhood you thought you knew was actually a collection of private lives, all carrying the same small cuts. Birds were loud. Kids played in driveways like nothing happened. Life continued, but something under it was different. When we reached our house, the garage door stood half open, the same way it had the morning they stepped inside. The same angle, the same slant of sunlight across the cement. It felt symbolic, like a stage waiting for someone to walk into the wrong scene again. Only now the audience knows the script. I stopped at the driveway, staring at that opening. Feels different now, I said. My wife didn't look at the garage. She looked at me. "It's just a garage," she said. Simple words. Heavy meaning. What she meant was, the garage wasn't the problem. It was never the problem. The problem was the story that grew around it. A story created by people who believed paper gives access the way law does. A story where the shelf became evidence, not furniture. We went inside. Life didn't snap back into normal. It slid into something like it. Slow, gradual, uncertain. Later that evening, around 6, my phone buzzed. A new email from the board. Not from an official account, from Karen's personal HOA address. That alone told me the tone before I read it. The email wasn't long. It started with a sentence that tried to sound professional but carried the weight of someone who just lost control. Today's meeting was not scheduled as a vote, and the results are not recognized by the board. There it was. Denial. Not of the event, of the meaning. 1,000 hands could rise, but if the board didn't count them, it wasn't real inside their structure. Power doesn't give up its illusion easily. The rest of the email was a tangled paragraph of policy citations and warnings about proper channels and respectful communication. But the last line wasn't policy. It was personal. We expect cooperation moving forward. Cooperation. Another word they used like a hammer wrapped in ribbon. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't have an answer, because the answer wasn't mine to give anymore. The community had already spoken. And that's what scared her. Not the shelf. Not the badge. Not my wife. The community. People who once whispered now voted with hands raised in a room she couldn't control. People who once avoided conflict now saw patterns. People who once thought it was just them now understood it was everyone. Fear of trouble became anger about being quiet too long. Silence collapsed like rotten wood. That night, I sat at the kitchen table while my wife read a book on the couch. The house felt peaceful in a way that comes after storms you didn't prepare for but survived anyway. I stared at the email again, dissecting it like a puzzle. The board wasn't fighting us. They were fighting the collapse of the story they lived inside. They built a structure where they mattered, where their signatures meant compliance, where every notice justified itself. And we had walked into that story and said, no, it doesn't. The board wasn't designed to hear no. No means limits, and people who build their identity around authority feel limits like personal attacks. Sometime around 9 p.m., my wife put her book down and glanced at the email on my screen. Don't respond, she said. I wasn't planning to. They're not talking to you, she added. They're talking to everyone else. That took me a minute. What do you mean? She leaned her head back on the couch, eyes soft, tone matter-of-fact. They're emailing you as a warning, but they're hoping you'll show that email to someone, so people get scared again. Fear as recycling. Fear as the tool. Not policy. Not fines. Fear of becoming the story. She was right. Fear didn't vanish in a day, but it cracked. And cracks grow when light hits them. What happened next surprised me. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. The next morning, I found a handwritten note in my mailbox. Folded twice. No name. Inside one sentence. Thank you for not letting them make us small. No signature. No explanation. Just gratitude. From someone who probably felt the same smallness I saw in that elderly neighbor's eyes when he talked about hedge measurements like a court order. Later that week, 3 other notes appeared. Different handwriting. Same message beneath the words. Thank you for saying no. That's when I realized something painful. People weren't scared of rules. They were scared of consequences. Not real consequences. Imagined ones. Social consequences. Being labeled difficult. Being targeted quietly. Being on the board's list. When people fear retaliation, rules don't need force. Fear enforces itself. The board had controlled this neighborhood not with power, but with assumption. Assumption that they could decide. Assumption that everyone would comply. Assumption that printed policy was law. Assumption is fragile. Break it once, and everything shifts. By Friday, something changed I didn't expect. People wanted to talk. In driveways, at the mailboxes, during dog walks. Not about the violation, about their stories. Stories like mine. Stories that sounded small until you realized how many existed. A woman cried, frustrated, not sad, while telling my wife about a letter she got because her son left a basketball by the doorstep where someone saw it from the sidewalk. She paid the fine, $50. Not because she agreed, but because challenging felt dangerous. Dangerous. That was the word she whispered like it was a confession. A community that fears a board over paint cans is a community that forgot its own identity. We didn't fix everything that day. We didn't dissolve the board. We didn't rewrite policy overnight. We didn't erase years of quiet compliance. But we did something more powerful. We exposed the illusion. And once illusions break, power can't go back to being invisible. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. Imagine power collapses when someone sees the strings. The board realized that too late. Over the next week, 3 things happened almost at once. First, whispers became conversations, and conversations became collective memory. People remembered their own violations like scars. Second, the board tried to reassert procedure. Paper, emails, language dripping with policy, like the words themselves could put the genie back inside the bottle. They misunderstood something fundamental. You can't legislate comfort back into people who just learned they weren't alone. Which leads to the third thing, the most important one. People began speaking without fear. Not yelling, not attacking, just speaking. Spoken truth is messy for systems built on silence. On the 7th day after the meeting, a retired teacher named Sam, a quiet man who smiled every time we passed, knocked on my door. Not timid, not apologetic, confident. He asked if I could talk for a minute. We sat on my porch, the wood warm under the afternoon sun, and he told me his story. A story that sounded familiar because it followed the same shape. Rule, letter, embarrassment, compliance. And, of course, I didn't want trouble. He told me the board once gave him a written warning about a non-regulation mailbox flag. A mailbox flag. He thought it was absurd. He wanted to argue, but he was recovering from surgery. He didn't have strength for conflict, so he replaced the flag. Bright red to dull regulation brown. He hated it every morning. Not the color, the memory. That was when I realized something profound. The violations never mattered. The fines never mattered. The humiliation mattered. Being told you're wrong over something normal. Being told fix this when nothing was broken. Being told you failed when you were living your life. Every letter wasn't a correction. It was a statement. We have authority. You do not. That's why people paid. Not because the board was right. Because resisting meant stepping into a spotlight you didn't want. And stepping into the spotlight meant becoming a target. Nobody wants to be eaten by whispers until someone refuses to be quiet. Then whispers turn into voices. Sam looked at me with eyes hardening in resolve. We don't need them, he said. Not angrily, just clearly. We can run this community ourselves. Fairly, respectfully, without treating each other like offenders. The idea wasn't new in the world, but it was new in his voice, a man who once changed a mailbox flag to avoid trouble. I didn't know what to say at first. Because he wasn't asking me to lead anything. He was asking me to not be alone. People don't start movements. People start conversations. Movements happen when enough conversations point in the same direction. Later that night, my wife sat beside me, feet up on the coffee table, flipping through a stack of notes gathered from our mailbox that week. Do you understand what's happening? She asked. Not fully, I admitted. She smiled. That small, tired smile of someone who knows the shape of change even when others don't. They're remembering who the board works for. Not works with. Works for. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said something I'll never forget. Authority flows upward, not downward. The board spent years reversing that. They forgot their role. Not because they were evil, but because nobody reminded them otherwise. Power expands to fill the space silence leaves. But silence was gone now. That night, sitting beside her, I realized something important. This story wasn't about confrontation. It was about restoration. not taking power, returning it. The following Saturday, the board scheduled a special meeting, their attempt to take control back. They wanted procedure. They wanted order. They wanted everyone to forget that truth had already spoken without their permission. But truth doesn't need permission. Truth is the permission. And when that meeting began, when the room filled again, they learned something they never expected. People no longer feared trouble. They feared staying quiet. And that fear is stronger than any policy ever printed. That's where part 3 leaves off. Not with triumph, not with collapse, but with a community standing on the edge of its own voice, ready to speak louder than the imagined authority that once walked into a garage believing policy was a key. The second meeting didn't feel like a repeat. Felt like a reckoning. You could sense it in the air before we even reached the clubhouse. That subtle electricity a neighborhood has when people finally decide they're tired of being polite about something that's been wrong for too long. The parking lot was full. Not just cars, people. People walking together instead of alone. People talking before the meeting instead of after. People with folded papers in their hands. Not violation notices, but copies of rights, bylaws, printed screenshots of statutes. Little scraps of confidence they'd gathered since the last meeting. That alone told me everything. They weren't afraid of trouble anymore. They were afraid of letting trouble continue. The clubhouse doors stood open, like someone expected a crowd bigger than the room. You could see the board members through the glass, sitting at the same long plastic table, arranged like a barrier between the crowd and the microphone. But their posture was different now. Less stiff formality, more guarded anxiety. They didn't own the room today. They were occupying it. As we walked in, conversations quieted. Not into silence, into anticipation. People didn't stop talking because they feared interruption. They paused because something important was about to happen. My wife wasn't in front of me this time. She walked beside me, not leading, not following, equal. She wore the same dark jacket she had worn in the garage. Not as a uniform, not as a power display, but as a quiet reminder that authority doesn't need permission from those pretending to have it. We took seats again among the people, not on stage. That mattered just as much now as it did before. Power is not where you sit. Power is what you refuse to become. The microphone squealed slightly when Karen leaned in. It wasn't dramatic, just defective. A reminder that control is fragile in small ways before it collapses in big ones. "Good afternoon," she began, trying to sound like this was normal. "This is a special meeting called to address concerns raised during last week's discussion." But she didn't get any further. A hand rose in the third row. A simple gesture. Not disrespectful. Not aggressive. Just someone in a room full of their neighbors asking to speak before the script began. Karen tried to continue. "If we can review agenda items first." The hand stayed up. This time someone else raised theirs. Then another. Then a dozen more. Not a shouting match. A wave. Not of rebellion, of recognition. "We're not listening to a script anymore." Karen looked at the board members beside her, waiting for someone to rescue the order she wanted to impose. No one did. The man with the clipboard, the one who once believed he had authority to walk into my garage, stared down at his papers like they'd become too heavy to hold. The others shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable in the sudden brightness of accountability. Karen cleared her throat. "Yes?" she said, forced politeness coating a voice that was used to directing, not answering. The woman with her hand raised, the one who laughed at the absurdity of the board's explanation last time, spoke. "We want to address what happened first, before anything else. Simple, direct, before agenda, before procedure, before the performance. Address the truth." Karen hesitated. "Our goal is to have a structured meeting." The woman interrupted, not rudely, but firmly. "It wasn't structured when you entered someone's home without permission." The room breathed, not applause, not shouting, breathing, a collective exhale of truth. Karen blinked. Twice, just like Clipboard Woman blinked in the garage when my wife asked the question that dismantled their illusion. "Did you enter with permission?" Karen opened her mouth to explain, but explanations were no longer shields. People didn't need narrative. They already had facts. Someone in the back spoke. You've been telling us what rules we broke for years. Now we're telling you what rule you broke. That line cut cleaner than anything my wife could have said. The board had built a culture where every small action was a violation, every harmless object was evidence, every conversation was a procedure. Now the roles reversed. The board was the violator, and the community was documenting. Karen regained her microphone like someone clutching a lifeline. The board acknowledges that entering the garage may have been an error, but we want to clarify that. She stopped, because my wife stood. She didn't walk to the front. She didn't take the microphone. She simply stood where she was. And the room went quiet, not afraid, aware. Her voice carried without amplification. It wasn't an error. Those 5 words erased every attempt to soften what happened. Errors are accidental. Walking into a garage is a choice. She didn't need to say anything else. But she did, not to attack, but to confirm the truth everyone had learned. You believed you had the power to enter because nobody ever told you no. The sentence wasn't angry. It was diagnosis. Karen bristled, not because it was wrong, but because it hit something deep and unexamined. A neighbor near the front, a quiet man who once changed his mailbox flag out of shame, spoke next. You didn't respect our homes. You expected us to respect your letters. No shouting, no profanity, just logic stripped of fear. You could see something break in the board's expressions. That moment when someone realizes a system built on silence breathes differently when the silence ends. Karen tried to reclaim structure again, to build procedure around a moment that refused to be controlled. This meeting is not a disciplinary. A man in a baseball cap stood. His voice shook. Not with anger, but with a strength he didn't know he had until now. This meeting is about trust. Not policy, not fines, not compliance. Trust. The thing nobody could print on a letter. He pointed at the board table, not aggressively, but clearly. You broke it. Those 3 words, you broke it, carried more weight than any handbook ever drafted. Because violations are about rules. Trespass is about trust. Rules can be argued. Trust cannot. Karen's jaw tightened. You are making this personal, she said. The woman in the 3rd row answered. It was personal when you walked into his home. The board shifted. They weren't ready for this form of confrontation, one built not on outrage, but on emotion that refuses to be minimized. My wife sat again, not withdrawing, but allowing the community to speak for itself. This wasn't our fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who had a letter that felt like humiliation. Everyone who trimmed a hedge out of fear. Everyone who changed a mailbox flag in shame. Stories filled the room. Not shouted, shared. A woman near the aisle. They photographed my garden and told me my roses were non-conforming. I dug them out. My husband didn't talk to me for 2 days because he was so upset. And I told him it was fine. It wasn't fine. Her voice cracked. Not from weakness, but from finally speaking pain she minimized. The board didn't have answers for that. Because policy doesn't know what to do with hurt. A man with gray hair spoke next. They fined me for a ladder being visible during repairs. I was fixing my roof after a storm. I paid the fine instead of fighting it because I was afraid they'd raise it. He laughed. One of those broken laughs you make when you realize how absurd your fear sounds after it dies. So I paid money because my roof was damaged. Silence. Then nods. Not pity. Recognition. People weren't waiting to speak. They were waiting to stop hiding. 2 teenagers, barely old enough to care about HOA rules, stood together. They told us we couldn't chalk the driveway because it looked messy. We were writing messages for our mom when she was sick. A murmur swept through the room, the kind of collective discomfort that makes adults ashamed on behalf of other adults. An older neighbor. They sent a letter because my grandson's bicycle was too close to the sidewalk. I thought it was ridiculous, but I moved it anyway. Why? Same answer under every story. I didn't want trouble. Those words became the recurring confession, the refrain of a neighborhood that had been quietly suffocated by people who believed their binder of rules outweighed the dignity of neighbors. Karen watched the room turn into something she couldn't regulate. She didn't shout. She didn't defend. She didn't even flinch. She looked lost. Not in guilt. In collapse. The collapse of a narrative she had never questioned because nobody ever made her question it. When the story slowed, my wife stood again. Not to conclude, but to complete the moment. She didn't hold her badge. She didn't mention her job. She wasn't there as a marshal. She was there as a neighbor. Everyone in this room understands rules, she said. We follow laws every day because we respect the communities we live in. She looked at the board. You used rules to take respect away. She paused, letting the truth settle on its own. The purpose of a community board is to protect shared spaces, not invade private ones. Her eyes moved across the crowd. Not scanning, connecting. Nobody here is asking you to disappear. We're asking you to remember your role. Not revenge. Responsibility. The board works for the community, not above it. Those sentences reframed everything. The board wasn't the villain. The board was wrong about its identity. And people who are wrong can change, if they are willing to face the truth. Karen finally spoke. Voice soft, like she had lost volume somewhere between pride and realization. I didn't know it felt like this, she said. Honest, unpracticed, painful. She wasn't evil. She was blind to the consequences of her comfort. We thought we were helping, she added, almost whispering. We thought rules kept everything fair. But you became unfair to keep rules, someone said quietly. That sentence didn't sting. Clarified. Karen looked at the man with the clipboard, not accusing, but seeing him. He looked back. Eyes tired, posture slack, guilt heavy. I'm sorry, he said again. Not to us specifically, but to the room. Not for trespassing. For everything. For the mailbox flags. For the ladders. For the chalk messages. For the roses dug up in shame. Apology is a strange thing. It doesn't fix past harm. It allows healing to begin. Karen lifted the microphone again, not to defend, but to surrender something she didn't need to hold anymore. We need to change. There it was. Not dramatic. Not scripted. Real. We need to change. People nodded, not like an audience approving a performance, but like neighbors accepting responsibility with her. Change wasn't hers to give. It was theirs to build. We will draft a policy, she continued, that bans board members from entering any personal property without explicit, written consent. Explicit, written, consent. The room exhaled. Because boundaries don't prevent community. Boundaries protect community. And we will review every rule that caused people to feel humiliated or afraid, she added. Humiliated. Afraid. 2 words no policy should ever justify. The woman from the 3rd row asked, What about fines? Karen nodded slowly, thoughtfully. We'll suspend all fines until we finish the review. Silence, not shocked, relieved. Suspended fines meant people weren't living with anxieties disguised as invoices. A neighbor asked, And the old ones? Karen closed her eyes, a moment of reckoning. We'll look at each case, and we'll make it right. Make it right. Not void payments. Make it right. The difference between procedure and restoration. My wife sat again. She didn't smile. This wasn't a win. It was a reset. What happened next wasn't dramatic. There was no cheering, no applause, just quiet conversations, soft voices, hands on shoulders, neighbors turning strangers into allies. People stayed long after the board left the table. Not to argue, to connect. A neighbor came to me, not to thank me, to give something. I want to help, he said, in whatever comes next. For the first time, the board wasn't the center. The community was. We walked home at sunset. Not triumphant, reflective. The light stretched long across the street, warm and soft. Like the day was finally closing its eyes after being kept open too long. My wife's shadow walked beside mine. Elongated, gentle, moving in sync. We didn't talk at first. There was nothing to analyze. Truth had already done the work. When we reached the driveway, the garage door was half open again. Same angle. same sunlight, same shelf. But everything was different. Not because the board changed, because we did. We remembered the line. The simple, sacred, unspoken line. Home is not community property. Policy is not permission. Rules are not keys. You knock. If no one answers, you walk away. My wife stopped at the threshold, the place where private becomes visible, where sunlight becomes interior. She put her coffee mug on the workbench, same motion as that morning, not as a statement, just a habit. Then she looked at me. They ran, she said quietly, because someone finally told them they were pretending, not cruel. True. Authority built on fear is a performance. Authority built on respect is service. That's the difference between a clipboard and a badge, between imagined power and earned responsibility. We stood in that garage while daylight faded, not thinking about shelves anymore, not thinking about emails, not thinking about votes, thinking about neighbors, people who spent years whispering into the dark, all whispering the same sentence. I didn't want trouble. And one day, quietly, in a simple garage, with a half-open door and a coffee mug on a wooden bench, someone finally said, no, not as confrontation, as freedom. That no didn't end a fight. It began a community. And if the story made you feel something, the kind of something that sits in your chest and whispers, I would have said no too. Then let's keep sharing these stories. Because somewhere out there, someone is looking at a violation letter over a mailbox flag, a child's chalk drawing, a shelf in a garage, wondering if they're the only one who feels small. They're not. You're not. We're not. So if you want more stories like this, real stories about quiet power, real boundaries, and people who finally found their voice, make sure you subscribe. It helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. And if you've ever had your own run-in with fake authority, overreach, or someone using policy like a key, write it in the comments. Not for the algorithm, for the neighbor who's been afraid to speak. Let's build a community that remembers. You knock, and if no one answers, you walk away. I'll see you in the next story. Stay loud, even when you speak softly.